Hey there, it's Dan from the Salty Sea. I'm here with another Warcry faction rundown, this time with Stormcast Sacrosanct. They're Sigmar's collection of mages, brought together from the best wizardly heroes in humanity's history and unleashed during the Soul Wars to provide magical reinforcement to its Stormcast armies. That's how their faction fluff goes. And their playstyle succeeds in giving you the feeling of indomitable warriors, bravely facing down impossible odds. Each one of them will take out multiple fighters from other warbands before it goes down, and any opponent foolish enough to rush you head-on might be in for a rude awakening. They have some issues competitively that make them one of the weakest factions in the game for tournament play, but they still succeed at creating that band of heroes playstyle that draws players to GW's Space Marine type factions year in and year out, through periods at the top of the meta and bottom alike. You might hear me float my ideas for improvements once or twice, but for the most part, I want to take this faction at face value. Let's see if I can make you want to play them no matter where they fall on the tier list. Now, one of the best reasons to play these guys in Warcry might just be that a lot of people already have them from the various Soul War starter sets, so it'll be easy to get your hands on them. And they look great in a ton of different color schemes. The combo of robes and chunky armor makes for a model that looks good with minimal effort speed paint, but still rewards you for taking the time to improve your hobby skills while you paint them. Now they're also great in multiplayer. A lot of the units in this warband fill their roles really well, so they can be really good in 2v2 if they're combined with an ally warband that doesn't have what they provide and has the things that this warband doesn't have. For example, Grandhammer Sequitors have the same role as Saurus Guard, but arguably do it better if you have a Seraphon teammate. Finally, you have a lot of punch here. Your best units have a real impact on the battlefield, so you'll never feel like you're just rolling some dice for no reason. Every dice roll is going to matter. Now, the first of the drawbacks for this warband is the lack of flexibility. You can't get 3 Castigators into a warband without dropping down from 5 to 4 units, and the models in this warband are already too weak to justify having only 5 models, so going down to 4 is impossible. Then we have their abilities, which are generally poor. That's extra frustrating for them because their story says that they should be mages. If these are battle mages, shouldn't their abilities, the personifications of their magic, be really good? It's a shame that they missed on this one. Finally, Stormcasts are really slow. This happens in just about every version of Age of Sigmar Warhammer for Stormcast, but each one has just 4 movement. Your best unit is an archer who wants to stand still and shoot. Your units have good combat stats, but your opponent is going to be the one who decides where and when the action happens. Now, a quick aside before I run down the units. I like to quote a single-digit number for how damaging a unit is or how survivable it is. I create a formula to evaluate units at a glance, and the 2 numbers work great for melee units when you combine them with mobility. To give you a relative sense of how the numbers go, Nagash's graveyards have likely the best DE score in the game at 11.9, while the terrible Javelin Skink scores at 2. Anything above 6 for either score is totally respectable, and that's really all you need to know. Now, when Games Workshop previewed this warband, they made some comments implying this would be Stormcast Castigators. Presumably because this unit is so bad in Age of Sigmar, they wanted to give it a little boost in this game. Now, they do have pretty high range damage. They can do 5 damage to toughness 4 or 3 units every shot, so you'll expect your Castigator to take out a chaff unit every single round. Now that's excellent, but it only works if it doesn't move. So your Castigator isn't going to do any objective play for you. Let's say every round it takes out a 65-point chaff unit. By the end of the game, it's paid for itself, which is great for any sort of kill X unit mission. But in any other mission type where the chaff units have been running around, scoring objectives, picking up treasure, etc., while the Castigators are shooting them down, you've actually fallen behind, even though you've killed your points worth in units. Now let's add the ability, Burst Lightning. It works on one of your shots, and it'll take it from doing an average of 5 damage to 12 against a toughness 4 enemy. So it boosts your total damage per round to 17. Now if you can use your wild dice to create triples, you're taking out non-chaff units, legitimate frontline units, every round. Or you can one-shot a chaff unit and then use your second activation to move to an objective or shoot off another wounded unit. So that means the first Castigator you take is an excellent unit, good enough that any warband would be happy to have one. The second one, because it's not using an ability, wouldn't be worth its points in some of the most competitive high-tier warbands, but in this warband it's still very good. Now, Castigators might be the backbone of this warband, but you're still going to need frontline melee troops. And they can be Evocators or Sequitors. I'll start with Evocators, which come in 2 varieties. One is sword and staff, and one is the Grand Stave, which is just their 2-handed weapon. This trade-off is about the 2-inch reach of the Grand Stave versus the extra damage and the better use of the ability that come from the sword and staff. Now, the sword and staff create an entire extra point of damage per activation, which is pretty significant. This warband already has a better version of what the Grand Stave Evocator does, so I'm not very inclined to take it over the sword and staff. Celestial Lightning only works in 1-inch range anyway, so the extra damage is better. It still does less damage than Sequitors, but to get the utility of having that ability at your fingertips, it can still be a reasonable choice if you're using a Sequitor Prime as your leader. Now Sequitors come in 3 varieties. One with the Great Mace, and then 2 that you really don't need to worry about, the Sword and Shield and the Mace and Shield. Now, those 2 do so little damage for their points that I was honestly shocked when I saw their war scrolls, so the less we talk about them, the better. Now the Great Mace, on the other hand, is an excellent unit. It has 2-inch range and 7 damage per activation against toughness 4. This is a legitimate elite unit, and maybe the only melee troop in this warband that can really say it's worth its points. There's no ability to speak of, but all this damage comes from just 3 attacks. So the Great Mace Sequitors use Onslaught really well. The universal ability for just a double represents 4.67 damage against toughness 4 on a double attack turn, meaning this unit can potentially one-shot semi-elite infantry once it's stuck in combat. Now we get to their abilities. Like every warband, they have technically 6 abilities. 3 of them are so bad you'll wish you could take back the time you spent reading them. Another 2 are situational and maybe not great, but you'll want to keep them in mind. One of them is actually very good. Let's start with Celestial Lightning. On a double, it represents about 1.75 damage 1 inch away from your Evocator. It's very situational, but it can be used to finish off a wounded fighter before your activation, allowing you to move and freeing you up to do better things than taking off someone who has 1 damage left or 2 damage left. Now, Burst Lightning is their triple, and I alluded to it in the Castigator section, but it is excellent. For 1 shot, it averages 7 extra damage against toughness 4, and it turns the first Castigator from a solid unit to amazing. Now, Open the Redemption Cache is your quad, and it does your roll, so let's average to 3.5 damage to all units within 3 inches. It's identical to the Iron Golem's quad, which that warband uses very well, but a Sequitor Prime is slower than the Iron Golem that has it, so getting into position is harder. You also have a low model count, so if you run her into the center of your opponent's force, you'll pop the ability, weaken some things, and then get surrounded and killed. All in all, the Iron Golems just use this ability better. Now the real unofficial ability of this warband is Onslaught, because the two-handed staff wielders use it so very well. Now I do want to make a quick aside here to just ask, why are these abilities so bad? This is a warband with a lot of competitive weaknesses, and that's okay. Not every warband needs to be tier 1. Slow, lack of bodies. These make sense for a faction of heavily armored mage warriors from another realm. But these are Sigmar's collection of the greatest battle mages humanity ever produced. Magic should be represented in their abilities, right? They could have used this as an opportunity to push the boundaries of what abilities can do in this game. And they wouldn't have made an unbalanced warband, since the weaknesses otherwise ensure these would have stayed fine in competitive play. I'm sad they chose not to do that, but I still had a ton of fun playing this warband. So let's move on to their leaders. Now I'd love if we could use the Knight Incanter to dish out some spells, but instead we have these 5 different melee hero options. And you know what that means. There can only be one. First, let's take the Sequitors. The Sword and Shield and the Mace and Shield ones are honestly just worse versions of the Redemption Cache Sequitor Prime. It has a dice ability, and they don't. They cost essentially the same amount of points, and they do essentially the same amount of damage. Now, the Evocator Prime with the Grand Hammer versus the Sword and Shield is a legitimate debate. It's very similar to the Evocator Troop debate, except that the Evocators are better as leaders. It's 2-inch reach versus 1 more damage per activation. I still land on the Sword and Staff version because I almost always go with extra damage. Now let's talk about the Evocator Prime versus the Sequitor Prime with the cache. It's about having access to this quad versus the extra damage. I started out taking the Sequitor Prime in lists, because the ability appears to be the best way to make up for your lack of bodies. The maneuver of double move, rely on your durability to last until the next round, then use wild dice to create a quad, doesn't work consistently enough. Most warbands can either ignore her, or still put enough focus fire on her to take her down despite her 6 toughness. Which, by the way, the jump from 5 to 6 toughness rarely matters. Not never. It matters against some warbands, but the difference between the Sequitor's 8.4 tank score and the Evocator Prime's 7.8 is small, compared to a difference of 3.7 to 6.3 on damage efficiency. The quad dice ability simply doesn't make up that ground in 1v1. In multiplayer, it's a different story. There's a much higher likelihood of getting 4+ units in range. So you can keep the Sequitor Prime and have a lot of fun with it. Now, the one ranged leader is the Castigator Prime. It does the same damage as a normal Castigator, but has more durability. Unfortunately, it costs 255 points, which is a lot. And extra durability really isn't as helpful on a ranged unit, because they want to be far away from combat anyway. The only exception to that rule is when 2 ranged warbands are having a shootout. So if you know your buddy is going to be bringing a ranged warband, the Castigator Prime is a good choice. Otherwise, you should avoid it. Now, list building with this warband doesn't give you a ton of choices, but you can still come to a fun list. You've heard me while discussing the units essentially put them into roles where some units are honestly just better versions of other units that are in the warband. So we get to something that is a pretty definitive 1v1 list. The Evocator Prime with Sword and Staff does quite a bit of damage and can be legitimately difficult for opponents to deal with. It'll blow up mid-sized units in 1 activation, and with a damage per attack of 8 against toughness 4, it can sometimes take out 2 chaff units in 1 combat if your opponent thinks surrounding it is going to bring it down. Some mobile opponents will have a way to just ignore it in some missions, but when you can bring its power to bear, it'll do a lot of damage. Now once we've got the leader taken care of, we go to the other melee troops, and the Sequitors with the great maces are probably your best option there, for all the reasons I talked about in the Sequitor section. Finally, we get to our Castigators, and while we'd love to be able to run 3 of them in a list with 5 units, the points just don't work out that way. So your best unit you'll just have 2 of, and they'll stay in the back and shoot down chaff all day long. I feel pretty good about saying this is the definitive 1v1 Sacrosanct list. It'll hold its own in casual play, but it won't crack into any competitive tournament meta. Like I said at the top of the show, not every faction needs to be tier 1. And if you like the models as much as I do, there's plenty of ways to have a great time with Sacrosanct, despite their low power level. One of those ways is, of course, multiplayer. In multiplayer, the area of effect redemption cache ability for a quad on the Sequitor Prime, it gets much better. It's hilarious in the 3-player King of the Hill variant. And in 2v2, your ally can bring a list with bodies to gum up the board and force team fights, where the redemption cache can shine. With that as a leader, we can replace a Sequitor with an Evocator to keep access to the utility from Celestial Lightning. And we have a list that functions great in a big game with buddies and brews. I live in the States where COVID is still preventing that kind of game from happening, but I hope some of you living in countries that have the virus better under control can hopefully try this out soon. There you have it. Stormcast Sacrosanct is a faction with sweet models and a few competitive liabilities that don't have to stop you from having a good time. Let me know if you've played them in games or what you think of them. If you're enjoying these faction rundown videos, please click the thumbs up button and give a thought to subscribing. I'll keep making more of these in the future, and I'm thinking about other types of videos I can do, so feel free to leave a comment about what other sorts of content you might like to see. Until the next time, may all your rolls be crits.